I'd actually like to start out by acknowledging my co-authors on this talk. So Kyle Dexter's just joined the University of Edinburgh as a lecturer. Tiina Sarkkinen is actually a postdoc working with Sandy, who joined, fortunately for us, the Royal Botanic Garden Edinburgh just this month. Tim Baker and Oliver Phillips from the University of Leeds, and my long-term collaborator Matt Lavins from Montana State in the US. So this is a picture from a really serious scientific work published in the 19th century, which is until a couple of years ago the only complete flora of Brazil. And I think it's somewhat sensationalist, but I think the goal of the artist was to convey the excitement that the first biologists felt when they got to the tropics. And what they were excited about was the tropical rainforest, the huge stature of those trees, the exuberant biological diversity. And I think that excitement has fed through to a general consciousness that all there is in the tropics is rainforests. And that view is actually, it can be somewhat problematic. And it can be somewhat problematic for the reason you can see in the next slide, which is encapsulated by an article that was published in The Economist just a couple of years ago. And I don't know if anyone saw this article. It's about the Cerrado of Brazil. Charles Godfrey mentioned it in passing. But how many people here, if you can be honest, how many people have ever heard of the Cerrado? Put your hands up. So I'd say about 20% of the audience have heard of the Cerrado. And yeah, I'm sorry if the slide is slightly out of focus, but it doesn't matter if you can't read this text. There was a big article here about the kind of intensification that Charles Godfrey was talking about. This is actually a leader right at the front of The Economist magazine. And what it's saying, if you can't read it, is isn't it fantastic that Brazil has intensified its agriculture to produce massive soya yields of this kind without ploughing up the Amazon basin? So they're making the point that we're ploughing up some kind of plain which is out of the Amazon basin, and in a sense that's useless land that's fair game for agriculture. And that's a problematic view because for those of us who are passionate about biodiversity conservation, this is a very beautiful place. So this is a picture. The Cerrado is a large savanna in central Brazil. But it's also an extremely biodiverse place. So the Cerrado contains 10,000 plant species. So just to contextualize that, there are about 1,500 native species in the UK. This is fantastically high diversity. And perhaps more importantly, 35% of those plant species aren't found anywhere else on the planet. And it's also an extremely big area. So the Cerrado is this grey blob here. It's 2 million square kilometres. That's a large part of Western Europe. And what this map shows is the areas of the tropics in South America which are too seasonally dry to support rainforest. So most of the rainforest is here, this white bit in the Amazon basin. So again, just think about the scale of this map, the continental scale. These are absolutely massive areas. And as much of South America is covered by non-rainforest vegetation as it is covered by rainforest. And what I want to talk about today is some of this vegetation that is found in these seasonally dry areas. And I'm not actually going to say too much more about the savannas of the Cerrados because my own research is by and large concentrated on these areas that are in black in this schematic map, which I call seasonally dry tropical forests, and that'll be an acronym I'll use through the slides. So these savannas grow on very poor soils. That's why the agriculture on them is a miracle in some ways. They are pH of less than 5, for example, whereas these seasonally dry tropical forests grow on much better soils. They're true forests. In the wet season, they have a closed canopy, and they don't have many grasses we find in these savannas. In the dry season, so these are photographs taken in exactly the same place. We don't have the vehicle in the second one. In the dry season, they look like a British woodland. They lose their leaves completely. Okay, so these are ecologically really rather different systems. And those dry forests, they can be everything from closed canopy forests to still closed canopy and not many grasses, but more of a scrubby vegetation full of cacti. So this is one from much further north in the distribution of this biome from Mexico. And the problem with those forests, this is something that Richard Bargett touched upon, soils critical to civilization, is they've been being cut down for a very long time because their good soils are very suitable for agriculture. So they're under great threat, something I'll come back to later in the talk. So thinking about conserving these systems, a lot of conservation decisions are based on thinking about which places have the most species. And if we just think about that, then that is a reason why rainforests are very important, because they are the most biodiverse systems. If we think about endemism, we think about species distributions, think about what distributions they're restricted to, we can start making a case for some of these other biomes. And I made the point that 35% of species in the Cerrado are found nowhere else. And before I start talking about some of my more molecular research, I wanted to mention the research I've been doing looking at endemism in seasonally dry tropical forests. It's the kind of field work that Sandy was talking about. So this involves going to areas that have not been surveyed, carrying out inventory work. It's painstaking work. So we go, for example, to a 1 hectare area of forest. We collect every single tree in that area. We bring back specimens to our herbaria and institutes like where Sandy works. We use experts like Sandy to help us identify this material, because there aren't identification guides. And we compare our species list with what's known about distributions of species. And some of the results have been quite remarkable. So I've been working, and I'll be talking a lot about these, in dry valleys, in-size valleys within the Andes of Peru. They're very dry, they're seasonally dry because they're rain-shadowed. So we see some fantastic plants, such as these spaghetti western-style cacti. And in these plants, in these valleys, up to 40% of the plant species in an individual valley, such as the Marañón Valley in northern Peru, are found nowhere else. So this is quite remarkable, and it's, for me, remarkable in the sense that within Peru, in the Marañón Valley, there's not a single reserve for this dry forest, because it's overlooked in that country, which holds more rainforest than any other country except Brazil in South America. Even the Peruvians don't know about the importance of their dry forests. And what I want to do in the rest of this talk is ask whether we can build a stronger case for these forgotten forests if we understand a little more about their evolutionary history. And I've been doing work reconstructing evolutionary histories for various reasons, mostly as in Sandy's introduction, because I'm interested in understanding the origins of tropical diversity. And the first grant I got was from the Leverhulme Trust to work on some dry forests. And as Sandy said, I'm a specialist in legumes. So some of the study groups were legumes, but we also wanted some generality. So we looked at some other groups. So this thing here it's in the Polygonaceae, which is the rhubarb family. So some rhubarbs are actually trees living in the tropical forests of South America. And these are by and large groups that are confined to these dry forests. And what we're doing in this science is trying to reconstruct evolutionary histories, reconstruct phylogenies of these groups. And this is actually a schematic depiction of the phylogeny of these legumes in the tribe Robineae. And what was most striking, and it was really my colleague Matt Lavin who pointed this out first, about these phylogenies for these dry forest groups, was what we call their geographic phylogenetic structure. So what I mean by this is if we ask the question, so if this one terminal is a species of Robineoid legume from Mexico, and you ask the question, where is its closest relative? By and large, the answer is its closest relatives is also in Mexico, that the phylogeny is structured geographically. So geographic proximity predicts phylogenetic relationships in a sense. So I want to show you another example with real data. So again, this is another legume. It grows in these dry valleys in the Andes. It was only known from southern Ecuador and northern Peru, but in some of our inventories in southern Peru, we found new populations, collected individuals from all those populations, sequenced them for various standard loci in plant phylogenetics, such as nucleoribosomal internal transcribed spaces. And this is the phylogeny. What I want you to concentrate on is the distribution of colours in this phylogeny that represent the geographic areas. So the northern populations are oranges and reds, the southern ones are greens. What we don't have is mixing of the reds and the greens. So what this tells us is historically there can't have been dispersal. There can't have been interchange between those areas. If there was, we'd see mixing of colours. And even in these quite closely spaced areas up in the north here, the Loja Depression of southern Ecuador, the Marañón Valley of Peru that I've mentioned, we see a pattern of what we call perfect reciprocal monophyly. This is a pattern of deep history with lack of migration between areas. And what we've suggested is, particularly in these Andean areas, this may represent the fact that these areas represent small sources and targets for dispersal. So this is kind of borrowing from island biogeography. And also, of course, in these Andean areas, the hugely tall mountains, 4,000, 5,000 metres, represent substantial barriers to migration. And by and large, this whole dry forest system in black is scattered in islands across the New World tropics. And that may be contributing to this pattern of the structure that we've seen. But it begs the question, sorry, this I just wanted to show you in a little more detail. This is work by Tina Sarkkinen, carried out for her PhD. I've just shown you one or two examples. Tina looked across maybe 10, 12 groups that we've now looked at and looked at that structure in a slightly more sophisticated way. So here she's asking the question is, what is the relationship between geographic distance and phylogenetic distance for pairwise comparisons of accessions in these trees? So we're asking, these have a low phylogenetic distance, they're related. What is their physical distance? And it's low. And when pairwise accessions are phylogenetically distant, they're also physically distant. So we see this positive slope on these graphs. It's a kind of isolation by distance approach borrowed from population genetics. But it begs the question, so I am going to say a few things about rainforests, is given that unlike this dry forest system that's scattered, the rainforests are found in one big area, big flat plain that's continuous, perhaps less barriers to migration. What's the geographic structure in that phylogeny? And so I'm working on another legume genus called Inga. It's very species rich in rainforests, in the Amazon and other rainforests. And my research here has been recently energized by a collaboration with ecologists who are working on herbivory in rainforest plants, Thomas Kersar and Phyllis Coley. And they're working on Barra Colorado Island. A lot of you will have heard of Barra Colorado Island, the most studied bit of rainforest in the world. And they wanted to know how the Inga species they're studying on that island, there's 12 Inga species, how they're related to each other. So to do that, this is actually old data, I've got more now, but this serves the purpose. For those 12 species on BCI, we reconstructed phylogeny, including a smattering of species from right across the geographic range of the genus. But what you can see in this phylogeny is those BCI species, they don't form a group, they are scattered right across the phylogeny. And that's a signature that those species must have come together in this area of southern Panama. So this is in the middle of the Panama Canal. They must have come together there by dispersal over geological timescales. It's a very different pattern than we saw in those dry forests. And so this is some unpublished data using the same isolation by distance approach. So now, working with Thomas Kersar and Phyllis Coley, who are studying in various sites across the Amazon basin, we, for example, sequenced all 40 species of Inga found at Los Amigos Biological Station in Peru and in other permanent inventory plots. And we can do exactly the same analysis. And for Inga, we see nearly a flat line. So that means that even when Inga species are physically growing closely together, they are not necessarily phylogenetically related. And that is, I think, possibly a general pattern in tropical rainforests. So these weren't biogeographic studies doing the same kind of analysis, but just by looking at the distribution of accessions included in phylogenies, I'm not going to show you the data. I think they show the Inga pattern, and they're not all trees. This one is the only ginger that grows in the near tropics. In the New World tropics, it's a herb. But I'd like this talk to have quite a conservation message, and you may be asking what's all it's got to do with conservation. What has knowledge of phylogenetic relationships got to do with conservation? And there is a move now to think, at least if we're thinking about individual organisms, to think about including knowledge of evolutionary relationships in conservation. And if you're not aware of this approach, I recommend visiting. There's an excellent website associated with this project of the Zoological Society of London. It's called the EDGE Project, Evolutionarily Distinct and Globally Endangered. And to give you an idea of the approach, so it's by and large being applied to cute furry animals and interesting frogs and things. So this little thing, it looks like a mouse. Monito del Monte means little monkey of the mountains. It's not actually a little monkey, it's a marsupial. And the interesting thing about this marsupial, so it's found in South America, it's the only living representative of a lineage that's 40 million years old. Its sister group, which is in Australia, there are more of them surviving. And the point that the EDGE scientists are making, surely it makes some sense to put a lot of conservation resources into saving the evolutionary history that is retained in this little thing than putting lots of resources into saving all those. Now, as Charles Godfrey was saying, I'm passionate about biodiversity. I'd like to save the lot, but we're in a difficult situation at the moment. We have some agonizing choices to make, and this is, I think, is the logic here. And what I would like to do is try and apply this logic to whole vegetation types in these tropical areas where I'm working. And let's think about the implications of this data for this genus Inga, if it's general. So if we're wanting to conserve the evolutionary history, the phylogenetic diversity of Inga, actually, that rainforest on Barra Colorado Island doesn't do a bad job because we've got lineages from right across the Inga phylogeny. So in rainforests, because it looks like they may be dispersal assembled, regional rainforest communities, they might have quite high and representative phylogenetic diversity. So this is right the western edge of the Amazon basin, one of the most species-rich areas on the planet. But my guess is the phylogenetic diversity in here might be quite representative of the rest of the Amazon basin. However, thinking about these dry forests in these interandean valleys, back to that example of Cyathostegea, local dry forest communities may contain unique phylogenetic diversity. So, if we think about the dry forests of Loja, a beautiful place, here they are, massive trees in the baobab family. If we just conserve those forests, but we ignore the forests of the Marañón, the Mantaro and Apurimac, we'd only conserve a little bit of the phylogenetic diversity of for Cyathostegea. So if Cyathostegea is general for dry forests, what we would be needing to be doing is conserving forest in all these areas. So I've been arguing from a very few examples, and so that is a problem. These are extremely rich systems. Cyathostegea is only one of hundreds of genera, even of legumes, that are found in these systems. So I've been lucky enough to get grant support from Natural Environment Research Council for a large collaborative project, which also is using funds from the US National Science Foundation. That was a personal fellowship to Carl Dexter for related research, where we're trying to generalize, and we're asking the question, is how is phylogenetic diversity spread across these major biomes in South America? How is it spread across the Amazon, the savannas of the Cerrados, and these dry forests of the Caatingas of northeastern Brazil, of the Chiquitano woodlands of the center of the continent? And we're doing this by teaming up with a series of people that, and this is literally decades of research, establishing permanent inventory plots right across these biomes. So that includes surveys of the Cerrados done by Edinburgh over 50 years, the Rainfall Plot Network, so that's where my collaborators Oliver Phillips and Tim Baker come in. That network is coordinated from the University of Leeds. And our main collaborator in Brazil, Ari Oliveira Filho, coordinates over 1,200 surveys right across Brazil. We're using these surveys as a means of sampling across these vegetation types. And what we want to do, we're kind of early on in this project now, is we want to reconstruct phylogeny for all the tree genera that occur there, and for 1,100 legume species, all the woody legumes if we can get them. It's ambitious, but I think it's achievable. And what's important about it is it's going to give us some generality and see if some of the patterns from these case studies are general. So again, thinking now about some conclusions and particularly emphasizing conservation issues, I think my biggest take-home message is that in the tropics, there's more than just rainforests. And these different systems of savannas and dry forests, they don't just differ in their floristic composition, in the plants that grow there. They differ in their evolutionary histories. I want to pause a little bit for thought now to think about relative levels of threat of some of these systems. So again, this is where I think the world's view can be somewhat skewed. So this is a view of the Amazon basin from the air. And what's quite good is when I fly into Lima, Peru, and you come in from Amsterdam, you go over French Guiana, you fly over Brazil, at 39,000 feet, you have this view, unbroken canopy for 3 hours. It's pretty inspiring. There's a lot of Amazonia left. A good news message is Amazonia is 70% intact. Now, this is not to say that we should be complacent, that we need to be not worrying about Amazonian deforestation, but it is one of the world's last wildernesses. However, if we think about the Brazilian Cerrados, which is where I started, 70% of those Brazilian Cerrados have been destroyed mostly by intensive agriculture, in the last 40 years. So that's in my lifetime. So that's 70% of 2 million square kilometres. And because some of the factors that Charles Godfrey was talking about this morning, such as increasing consumption of meat in China, which requires animal feed from soy, the spike in soy prices, that destruction is going on at a very alarming rate. But what even fewer people know about, what I care most about, is these seasonally dry tropical forests. And these are the world's most threatened tropical forests. In many areas, such as in the northeast of Brazil, less than 5% of their original extent remains. And they are not really in the conservation spotlight in many areas. And one of the reasons they're not in the conservation spotlight is something I mentioned earlier. That is because their destruction often happened, actually, in Latin America before the Spanish conquests. These are where a lot of the civilization started because, as Richard Bargett said, it's all about the soils. These have very rich soils. They're good places to grow crops. So I've occasionally, when I've been doing an inventory of these virgin dry forests, I've wondered after half an hour why the slopes go very steep and then flat and then very steep and then flat. And I've realised I'm actually inventorying on some kind of Inca terracing system, and it's not as virgin as I thought it was. So these have a long history of human impact. And because they're not these kind of virgin systems, they're not as valued, even within countries such as Peru, as they should be, because of their long history of disturbance, because they look like secondary forests. But they have a huge amount of endemic species. They have a very unique evolutionary history. And I think that they harbour a lot of unique phylogenetic diversity. And I'm hoping that this factor might be something, a new message that can help push their conservation a little bit more. Just to finish off, in terms of messages of what you can do, so I'm aware I'm talking to an audience of people who are teaching, of students who are going to be teaching other students, is please remember that there's more to the tropics than just rainforests. And if you're interested in learning more, we've got some new web resources at the Royal Botanic Garden, Edinburgh, about the Brazilian Cerrado and about seasonally dry tropical forests. And something else that I think is very interesting, and it echoes some of the things that Charles Godfrey was talking about, it's really made me think about the complexities of the global food system. I think as individuals, it's very interesting to look at some campaigns that are trying to raise awareness of global food chains. So the Round Table for Responsible Soy, which is supported by organisations such as WWF, I did some work with them to try and promote this via our outreach programme in Edinburgh. What that is asking is, can we please not grow soy on land that is newly deforested? And it's working, for example, with major supermarkets for them to improve their food chain so they can do labelling, so you know when you buy something that it's not going to have been produced on newly deforested land. So you may or may not agree with those campaigns, but I think that they're very interesting to help understand the effect, for example, of consumers in this country on tropical deforestation. Because soy from Brazil is feeding the chickens that you're buying eggs from. It's feeding cows that you're buying milk from. So just to finish now, I can see Sandy getting up. I'd like to acknowledge, it might seem rather strange, this spring, in inverted commas, day in Scotland, that we have so much tropical research going on. We have a very big group that I very much enjoy working on in Edinburgh. There have been nearly 20 people now working in the New World Tropics. I'd like to thank some funders, but most of all, as Sandy said, this is a field-based research programme. I'd like to thank the people that have helped me in that field work over more than a decade now in South America. So thank you.